So in this lecture, we're going to talk about cannabis business, and specifically, we're going to sort of think about this question about the common perception, or think about the common perception that cannabis companies are rolling in cash. So let's start off by just thinking about three different main categories when we're talking about the cannabis industry. We have medical and recreational cannabis. We have big pharma and plant-derived pharmaceutical products, and we talked some about that in the last lecture with respect to Sativex and Epidiolex. And then we have this burgeoning hemp and CBD industry, and you see this pictures on the side here with GW Pharma, and you see Charlotte's Web, the hemp company, and you see the recreational and medical products. And okay, so three main categories. Well, let's just think for a second take a look at the Colorado data in terms of sales to get a sense of of the industry and what's happening in Colorado. So in 2017, 11 million units of edibles were sold, 1 million units of topical products were sold, 28,000 pounds of concentrate, or 4.5 million units of concentrate were sold in 2017. That is obviously a lot of sales. The number of new marijuana business licenses and number of renewals also correspond with a booming adult use side of the state market. So adult use licenses made up about 77%. So we're talking rec licenses here, recreational licenses. About 77% of new licenses in 2017. Adult use or rec business licenses increased by 167 from January to December of 2017, while the number of medical licenses fell by 38. The number of plants grown in Colorado grew by 121,000 more cultivated per month in 2017 versus 2016. So all of these indications are showing rapid increases other than the falling number of medical licenses. Okay, so what's going on in terms of increasing availability in terms of price? This is an interesting chart that I picked up from Marijuana Business Daily, just showing the average market price per pound of flower over here on the y-axis, and then looking at basically the number of licensed cultivators across 2014, 15, 16, and 17. That are the bars. So the bars, the number of cultivators, and then looking at the price of flower in the orange line. So, and how that's changed. So here we have 192 cultivators in 2014, January 14, all the way up to now we're approaching close to 700. The point here is that as cultivation has increased, we see an inflection point here in 2016 where the price of flower starts to drop, which makes sense, right? We're having greater supply, and the price is dropping. And then, but we also can look across the nation at similar trends in both on average across the U.S., but also in terms of these states that are legal: California, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. Bottom line is we see the same kind of thing, that the price of wholesale cannabis is dropping rather significantly from, say, 2015-16 all the way to 2018. So what experts talk about is basically a race to the bottom. That what you see here is that the wholesale prices dropped from roughly $2,000 a pound down to $1,300 a pound, according to The Economist. And the price at some point will bottom out, right? And then, so here's a couple of important implications, though. State tax systems that are based on price also are taking a hit, right? So if you're basically taxing based on price of wholesale flower, and that drops in half, that potentially has a big impact on your tax revenue. So one big question here is, with this race to the bottom, at some point will big businesses take over in order to squeeze out profits by using a bigger scale, right? And so the point here is the price keeps dropping. In order to squeeze out profits, you've got to have a very efficient business. And sometimes, obviously, big businesses are better able to squeak out profits in a situation like this. So here's the thing, though. It turns out that though we're not quite there yet, it's still very competitive, even in Colorado, which arguably has one of the most mature markets out there. And this is just a chart, again, from Marijuana Business Daily, looking at the concentration of Colorado's retail marijuana market. And based on a specific index that people use to sort of gauge how concentrated the market is. And so basically what you see here is when you look at very mature markets or industries like aircraft manufacturing, tobacco, soft drinks, mattresses, especially with aircraft and tobacco, it's a highly concentrated market, right? Cannabis, the cannabis market in Colorado is still way down here in terms of being not so concentrated. Excuse me. Okay, so moving on then, this is another slide looking at the wholesale sort of retail markup in different states. And it's important to note that a big part of what people pay, of course, is also the tax. So in Colorado, there's 30% sales tax, 15% excise, 15% sales. Similar tax rates in California. Washington is like 37%. Oregon's lower at 17%. Nevada's in the middle at 25%. But this little nice graphic on the side here gives you just a sense of how these markups vary from state to state and how the wholesale versus retail price varies from state to state. So, and then of course, this is super important too. You know, in the very beginning of these legalized markets, flower made up a huge percentage of what was actually being sold. So you look over here in the sort of pre-2015 days, where the green is the percent, how much of the sales were basically bud or flower. But what you see here as we go through time, basically these other categories are taking up a much larger chunk of the market, right? So concentrates, pre-rolled forms, edible forms, vaporized products, infused products. These are all obviously it's not just flour anymore. It's other things as well that's contributing substantially to the sales. So another interesting graphic here, thinking about the cannabis industry. This is just comparing cannabis sales versus other industries. And so we see here beer sales. Beer sales, we're talking like $111 billion, right, a year. Wine was not included in this graph, so I just added it here. Wine's around $71 billion a year. So combined, just beer and wine, we're talking about $182 billion a year, right? That's the market. For cigarettes, about $80 billion market. I'm pretty sure it does not include e-cigs. And then here's the cannabis market, and so estimated total demand for rec cannabis around 50 to 55 billion. And then, just for fun, you can see donuts down here at about 20 billion, and then a whole slew of other sort of industries. So cannabis is pretty, it's up there, right? And not nearly as big as beer and wine, not even close, right? But definitely getting up there. Okay, so what about Big Pharma? So GW Pharma is one of the major players in this space, really the only one that's solely focused, the only big one solely focused on the medical space in terms of traditional medicine. And now there are others working in a similar space, Tilray, Canopy, for example, that are sort of up and coming. And then the idea is that these companies are going to work within the FDA rubric for how to achieve FDA approval and how to market drugs. And so the point here is they're going down the traditional pharma route of getting their products approved and marketed. And, obviously there are a number of investors who think this is a great idea because stock prices have been skyrocketing. And it makes some sense, right? If you look at Epidiolex, which is GW Pharma's CBD product, they're probably going to charge about $32,000 a year for each family that needs to use this product. And so these are children with severe epilepsy. Now, of course, the good news for those families is that if they have insurance, it will be paid by insurance. The bad news, though, of course, is that when things are paid by insurance, everybody's paying. So just to sort of track, this a little bit more, we have GW Pharma. Their valuation, when I pulled these data, their valuation was about $3.3 billion. Tilray's valuation about $9 billion. Canopy, we're talking about $15.5 billion valuation, and you can see here, the celebration, periodic celebration with respect to stock prices and so forth from these companies. And the idea here is that a company like Tilray, it's not just they're going to be working in Canada; they can export these products worldwide, and same, of course, with GW and Canopy. Okay, so facilities. This is fascinating. Apparently, you can see GW Pharma's grow space from orbit, right? Because it's 40 acres of glass, which tends to stand out even if you're in orbit. And obviously other companies like Tilray, Aurora, Canopy, they all have substantial investments in grow space and greenhouses. So pharma business as usual. So what is going on here? The cost of Epidiolex, it's pretty substantial. Obviously, now it's approved, can be paid by insurance. But this is kind of the typical pharma business model. And I think it's worth pointing out some of the drawbacks, right? So you have a company like GW Pharma. They have a product. They're going to basically charge people $32,000 a year to use this product. Well, they have to be very careful, because if they, for example, allow that product to be researched by somebody else, let's say, for example, and later on in the module on Parkinson's disease, you'll hear from a doctor, a scientist and clinician down at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, who's basically was doing research on CBD in Parkinson's patients, and was using Epidiolex, but then got cut off. And it's very problematic. And the reason she got cut off, presumably, is because GW Pharma doesn't want to take any risks if they are basically letting other people do research with their medication, and an adverse event emerges. That can have significant repercussions in terms of their profits, because then the FDA may get involved and decide, this is not as safe as they thought. And so what that means basically is they're very risk avoidant in terms of not wanting to allow other scientists to test their products in terms of effectiveness for other indications, because what they're basically doing is putting their profits on the line. So this is not unusual among pharma companies, but it's this, we're seeing the same thing now with things like CBD. So Sativex is another good example. Sativex is their one-to-one preparation that's approved in Canada and other countries. And, why isn't it approved here in the U.S.? Well, basically, it's, they see it as not profitable, right? And the point here is that companies, big pharma, they're basically, their objective is profit. And if something's not going to be profitable, they're not going to do it. And they're risk averse in terms of anything that might risk their profits. So interestingly enough, Tilray and other companies are not 100% committed to the pharma route, at least from my standpoint, which in some ways gives them, I think, a competitive advantage, because they can work in both spaces, the burgeoning cannabis industry in legalized markets, but also, of course, the sort of FDA route. And so I think when you look at Tilray and Canopy, their market cap may reflect that to some extent. But we haven't talked about hemp and CBD. Hemp and CBD is huge. It's all over the country. I get phone calls all the time from reporters and people wanting to know more about CBD. And so the recent Farm Bill at the end of 2018 basically legalized production of hemp and CBD. The FDA is currently attempting to formulate some kind of a regulatory framework, and we're going to talk more about this in future modules. I think this is very important. And the FDA is, I think, a bit overwhelmed right now trying to figure out how to deal with CBD. So very important distinction here. And actually, it's sort of an artificial distinction, right? Hemp versus marijuana. Are they two different things? Not really, no. Cannabis is the plant family that includes both hemp and marijuana and cannabis, right? They're all basically one family of plants. The only reason we even have this term right now, or the reason that people are using, is because it was defined in the legislation as basically a cannabis plant with less than 0.3% THC, right? So basically that is the definition, and it doesn't mean a whole lot. So if you have, you could have a quote hemp plant that's 0.4% and it can no longer be called hemp, right? So it's the same plant. It's just, whether THC is above or below 0.3%. And now, having said that, of course, there's a lot, as you saw in an earlier lecture, there's, or we'll see in future lectures, there is great diversity in the plant, right? In terms of THC content, CBD content, in terms of terpenes, in terms of narrow leaf, right? Narrow leaf, broadleaf. And but there's nothing really other than that 0.3% that makes something hemp or not hemp. So just important to understand that. Okay, so the hemp and CBD industry, huge growth. Sales are booming. In Colorado, what's interesting is CBD from the very beginning has been regulated like a food additive, right? You can find it on the store shelves here in Colorado, and that's been true for a long time. So you look at this graphic at the bottom. They're expecting, CBD sales to sort of look like this in terms of different channels. So pharmaceutical, internet or direct, practitioner, mass market. So basically, people are making these projections about the size of the market and how CBD will infiltrate in sort of different categories, whether it's pharmaceutical or it's natural, products, etc. So in conclusion, what's interesting is that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, as things have started to take off, as supply and cultivation increases, prices have been dropping. And, we can expect that to continue in some ways, although it's sort of difficult to predict because more and more states are legalizing, right? So demand's increasing at the same time. More and more people are cultivating. So it's something to keep your eye on. But in general, the trend has been downward. A couple of the things you'll be reading for this module, a couple of articles, news articles. And basically their point is that the fastest way to get rich in the cannabis space is to profit off of other people's belief that they can get rich off of cannabis, right? The point being that it's not necessarily the case that people are going to make money in cannabis because it's not actually very easy to make money in cannabis. Some of the early adopters maybe made more money when the profit margin was greater. Now margins are smaller, and there's more competition, and it's definitely more difficult. Part of where things are going is the production of or manufacturing of custom products, and you saw that in the figure where sales of things other than flour are increasing and making it make up a larger piece of the pie. I think it's useful to think about what is the model going forward. How is this going to shake out? Is this going to be more of a tobacco kind of a model when it matures? Is it going to be more of a beer industry kind of a model? Or maybe neither one, but I think definitely worth thinking about those issues. How is this going to shake out in 5, 10, 20 years? In terms of complementary alternative medicine, it seems like that's likely to show the strongest growth. I think that's where people are very interested in terms of using this for a variety of things, which we'll talk about, of course, throughout the other the upcoming modules. And certainly we need more research to understand whether, especially when it comes to CBD, whether these alternative sort of versions that you find on the market in states like Colorado are as effective as the pharmaceutical versions, right? In this case, GW Pharma and their sort of highly pure isolated CBD. Is it less effective? Is it more effective? And certainly the thinking, for the FDA is that's more effective. But if you look at one of the papers you'll be reading for this module is a paper by Ethan Russo published in 2019, and there's some suggestion in there, and also the papers he's citing in there that might not be the case. That in fact maybe some of these hemp-derived versions may be just as effective or more effective at the same dose. So again, I kind of already highlighted this for you, but I think it's worth discussing, worth thinking about these issues of how are things going to shake out in the future, and where profits will come from, and how much this eventually will be, sort of going the pharmaceutical route that's FDA approved, or how much of it's going to be sort of viewed as alternative complementary medicine that does not go through the normal drug, review process. And then this, to me, is a super fascinating question. Again, is does CBD on the shelf here in Colorado and other places, how does it compare to CBD from GW Pharma? Is it? It's definitely different because this is highly purified, whereas this may contain other terpenes and cannabinoids. But what exactly does that mean? What are the implications? I think stay tuned because that's going to be a fascinating question.